Talking about boundaries, when to say yes and when we should say no, how to come alongside people, what kind of help is appropriate, when we are enabling. Today we're going to talk about boundary perspectives, talk about some things biblically that we need to keep in mind when we think about coming alongside people. Next week, J.C. Chambers will talk about developing boundaries. We'll deal with some of the issues relative to how much is too much. But today, let's think about boundary perspectives a little bit. And I'm going to say a couple things that help us relative to understanding what does God want. You know, when we think about what each of us wants and what is best for all of us, God's will is best for all of us. So the question becomes, what is His will? And we're going to say a couple things this morning that God doesn't want us to become settled. And in fact, sometimes God wants us to become unsettled. And so it'll make sense as we think about it's not always helpful to come alongside a person and make everything fine, because what we'll see, God doesn't allow everything to be fine. We can't do what God will not do. God won't make life a cloud nine experience for those who are His children. That's what we'll see. He does not want us to become settled because, as we'll see, this is not our home. What we'll hear is that becoming too comfortable, having too good of boundaries, living within the safe confines of a life that is wonderful, might not necessarily be, it's not a good thing. God will actively create unsettling situations for us. That's what we'll see. God doesn't want us to become settled. Look what it says in Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. This is what we read. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return instead. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. This is the Hall of Faith chapter in the Bible, and in Hebrews chapter 11, what it recounts is person after person whose life demonstrated faith. And it's in homage to these individuals. It comes to this place, and it indicates something interesting for us that we need to think about as individuals whose faith God will want to develop. Would you agree with me that God's interest is in developing our faith? And so what can we expect if our faith does develop? And listen to what it says. These people were still living by faith when they died. And what it would have us understand is that up until the point of death, that they were still operating by faith. They were basing their security not on what they saw, but what God said. They were doing good. But yet it says they did not receive what was promised. And that's the interesting thing for us. They were living by faith when they died. And they didn't receive the things that had been promised. Those things don't seem like they should go together, do they? You know, when you're living by faith until you die, you should get the things promised, right? I hear that a lot. If you live by faith, you can get God to do what you would have Him to do. But these people were living by faith. Their faith was intact. And it overtly says so. Yet they did not receive the things promised. How did they evidence their faith then? We find three words. Number one, first word was welcome. Welcome. It says they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They were looking forward to receiving what they knew God would give them. And they were still looking forward to it when they died. And what it tells us is that what living by faith means is that we welcome things. That we do not become cynical or sarcastic relative to what God promises. And yet that we hold out and continue to wait for those things up until the point at which we die. Because, you understand the point, we're going to need to welcome the things that God promises us, because He will not give them to us, on all of them, on this side of eternity. We welcome. That's word one. Welcome. Secondly, it says admit. It says they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on the earth. They understood that they would get what God promised. They understood that when they got home, they would get to what was promised. They would get what was promised them. But what they understood is, this isn't home. If you're traveling, I'll be traveling in China next week. And I'll understand that there's some things that will not happen there because that is not my home. And in the same sense, what it would have us understand is that God promises some things. We'll get those things when we get home, but this isn't home. We don't get home until we leave this place, because this isn't home. And we welcome God's promises. We admit that we are aliens and strangers on the earth, that this is a temporary dwelling. It's like I'll feel next week in China, this time next week. Welcome, admit, and then finally, it says that they longed. It says people, they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. It says people who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country. They were longing for their heavenly home. Goes on to say, instead, they were longing for a better country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. They were looking for their heavenly home. What we find is that God prepares a city for those who long for it. He does not want us to become settled here, because this is not home. It is home, but it isn't. It's the material home that we need to take care of. That it's right to take care of family. It's right to take care of our existence. And at the same time, understand that the things that God will give us will not come to us during this life. We have to wait till we get home to get them. That's what these people understood. The people who were living by faith when they died. They welcomed God's promises from afar. They admitted that they were aliens and strangers on the earth, and they longed for a better country. Therefore, God was not ashamed to be their God, because He actively affirms and encourages the kind of mindset that leads us to understand this is not it. This isn't it. We think it's natural for us. Again, I'm going to talk about some things that are natural. You're not going to be able not to do these things, but to the degree we understand, this is the issue we deal with. You know what we do? We think like settlers rather than sojourners. Our mindset is a settler mindset, not a sojourner mindset. We welcome His promises on this side of eternity. We admit that if we don't have what we want, somebody is doing something wrong. We're not aliens and strangers, but somebody's not giving up. They're not doing what they should do. Because if everything worked as God wanted it to work, I would be happy. I would feel settled. I would be at home. To which God says, you're thinking like a settler. You're not thinking like a sojourner. We long to get others to do what we want them to do. We long to make boundaries that wall problems out and keep pleasure in. Why? Because we want this to be home. We want to settle down. We want to like our life. Not only want to, we feel entitled to. That's a settler mindset. And people who were living by faith when they died, they don't think like that. They welcome God's promises. But they admit they're aliens and strangers. And do you understand that? This is not your home. You're an alien and a stranger. The reason why you don't have what you want is because you're not home yet. It's not your boss's fault. Now, you might have lousy bosses and they need to change. It's not your wife's fault. It's not your husband's fault. It's not your family's fault. It's not because you live in America. It's not because you're a Democrat. It's not because you're a Republican. Do you know why you feel strange? Do you know why that restlessness is there? You know what I mean? Do you know what I'm talking about? That sense of, why? Why doesn't she do what I ask? Why do I have to set such firm boundaries? Because you're thinking like a settler. You're not home yet. You're not home yet. You know what it's like being in a strange place? Some of us forget that with God, according to Him, for us, this is a place, but this isn't His final destination. We resent not having what we want that will allow us to feel settled. Not only doesn't God want us to become settled, it's not just the absence of settled feelings. And what I'm saying, from boundary perspectives, now we will make boundaries, but just understand, for yourself and those you care about, if you're existing to try to make yourself have a life that is walling everything hard out and walling everything that good in, God will not be your accomplice because He doesn't want you to become settled. Understand that that's true of you relative to others. Sometimes others want their lives to be cloud nine, and they presume upon us to create that life and guilt upon us if we don't. Guess what? You're not going to be able to do what God won't do. You're not going to be able to create a life that makes somebody feel completely settled. Why? Because God doesn't want them to feel that way. And you're not responsible to make them feel settled. You're not responsible. And if you're angry at somebody else because they're not making your life settled, they're not responsible. It's what happens when we think like settlers rather than sojourners. You say, what's the solution? Because we're not going to be able to get rid of this. We're always going to want life. I want life to be comfortable. But what it says, we can do three things. We can welcome God's promises and commitments to us. And this is the second thing that some of us don't do. Admit that we're aliens and strangers from the earth. You know what happens when you start to admit? You start to distance yourself from entitlement. Welcome, admit, long for better country, the heavenly one. God doesn't want us to become settled. In fact, and this is the other side of it, God wants us to become unsettled. And what I mean is that God would actively introduce things into your boundaries that will unsettle you. Things that you want to wall out. You don't want to get them in. You want to keep them out. And God will not allow you to keep those things out. What it says, Deuteronomy 8, 2-3, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The issue that's difficult for us is that the same issue for them. They had a water experience. You know what a water experience was? Where God is the one that created favorable boundaries. So they're walking through the Red Sea, and there's walls of water on the right and the left. Talk about boundaries. And they right through the middle of them. Walking on dry land and boundaries on the right and the left. And not only did it protect them, those same boundaries suffocated and submerged their enemies. Those are the kind of boundaries we want. And they experienced them. Imagine their confusion when 3 days out from the Red Sea, because they weren't allowed to stay there. They were in the wilderness. And the wilderness is a place where this happens. Things that we don't want come into our life. Things don't stay in our life that we want to stay in. And what do we end up thinking? What happened to the Red Sea stuff? Let me go back to that thing, where God makes boundaries and I walk right through the middle. We've had those experiences. And then those experiences didn't last. And what do we end up thinking? What did I do wrong? Nothing. God doesn't allow us to become settled. He does things in our life to show us He's powerful, but what He'll do, lead us by the hand into the wilderness. And the wilderness is a place where your boundaries won't work. You'll want to wall things up, but you're not going to be able to, and it'll enrage you. You get angry, you'll hold yourself in contempt, saying, what's wrong with me? They won't do what I want. Nothing's wrong. You're not home yet. We're in the wilderness. Moving from place to place. That's what the wilderness is like. No place to call your own. You know what the wilderness is like? Where God leads you to a place and you've used all the water and you get to this place, guess what? No water. And it's not like, oh, geez, well, then I'm going to have to go to a store to get some. No water. And you used up all the resources, and now you're in a place where you're going to die. God leads you to places where you don't have what you need. And what do? I'm not blowing you up. I do the same stuff. We love to blame somebody. Who messed up? I'm in a place, no water. And you know what they did? They blamed Moses. But who was leading them through the wilderness? Who was leading them? Has it occurred to you that your rage at yourself and your rage at others is misdirected? You're thinking like a settler. God is the one that's leading you by the hand. Oh, that doesn't help. What He does is hardship. Hardship. Hardship was God's will for them. Wilderness is a place where we experience chronic hardship. And in the wilderness, He wouldn't allow them to have what they wanted. Listen to me. There's nothing fun about this. I'm not going to put a smiley face on this. Wilderness is difficult. And knowing about it doesn't make it any easier. But it makes it tolerable. No, that in the wilderness, He wouldn't allow them to have what they wanted. How do you say, how do you know? He calls them to hunger. What's hunger? What's hunger? It's a need. Is it wrong to be hungry? Is it wrong to be hungry? No. It was programmed in us. Is it wrong to want to be secure? Is it wrong? Is it wrong to want close relationships? No. But what God does in the wilderness, He doesn't allow us to have what we want. Relationships become distant. Security becomes elusive. We look for somebody to blame, but they won't take the blame. We get more angry, and it goes around and around until we get exhausted. Exhausted. We get to a place where we sit down. In the wilderness, you know what we uncover? What happens in the wilderness? We uncover our commitment to settling. Do you know why we get frustrated and enraged? Some of us show it outside. Some of us show it inside. It shows our commitment to settling. Why? Because this should be favorable. I should have what I want. That's settlement thinking. And again, I'm not blowing you up. And I'm not saying bad you. I'm just saying it's what we deal with. It's what's at the core of it. You're saying, how can I deal with these strong emotions? Understand where they come from. You're thinking and acting as a person who is home, and you're not. And why I say that is that sometimes we feel that God has abandoned us, and He hasn't. He wants you to welcome, admit, and long, because He does give you what all those things that you crave, security, all those things, but they're not going to happen here. He'll give you snippets of them, enough to whet your appetite, but not enough to satisfy it. Do you know what happens when we feel betrayed? We know this from studying children. Three things seem to happen. It begins with protest, becomes despair, and then it becomes detachment. Protest, despair, detachment. You know what that looks like? Protest is, give me what I want. And if that doesn't work, and when that doesn't work, both on our side and on the side of those who demand it from us, that are protesting, it becomes despair. You must not love me. And I'm doing that, but it's really not funny. Despair. It's how you feel when you feel deflated. I think that's what despair feels like. I think protest feels like hot air. And what despair feels like is no air. And when that goes on long enough, then it becomes detachment, because it's too painful to live with hot air or no air. And what we end up doing is, that's it. That's it. I'm going to go to work. I'll be pleasant, cordial. I'm not investing any emotional energy in anyone. I'm going to stay in my little world, detachment. It says in Hebrews 12, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Discipline isn't punishment. When God leads us to a place where we're not getting our needs met, when He's leading us to a place where we are unsettled, it's not punishing us for doing something wrong. He's not saying, I'm doing this so you'll stop that. That's not what discipline's about. It's what He does the water experience, but then the wilderness experiences come. And He does the wilderness experiences not because I'll teach you, it's because He wants us to start doing what's right, and that's where we'll have to define what holiness is. In the context, well, let's deal with humility first. The second thing should be, there it is, humility. A humble person has come to learn, here's what humility means. We think of, and I think I've defined it before, but it's a really weird definition, and you'll think of it, and it's one of those things where you say, okay, yeah, fine. But it's what it means. Humility does mean lowly. That's the word. Tapenos, low. This is humble, low. And it's not somebody who is self-effacing. Humility is the experience of a person that learned, I can't use what I have to get what I want. I can use hot air, no air, but they will not do what I want. And what humility is, the inability to use what we have to get what we want. That's what humility is. The inability to use what we have to get what you want. You say, Mike, what's a humble person? A humble person is a person who has been taught by God that they cannot use what they have to get what they want. Some of us are pretty charming. Some of us are pretty angry. Some of us blend into the background. We all have strategies for getting what we want. And if you don't give it to us, some of us hot air, some of us say, I'm going to back away from you until you give me what I want. Or until I don't feel it anymore. What humility is, none of those things work. They don't work. But the feelings don't go away. You know what I mean? The anger and the resentment, the protest, despair, and detachment. They don't go away. Humility, that's what humility is. It's a person who understands that they can't leverage their resources to meet their wants and needs. You know what else humility is? A humble person? Strange. Do you have the definition? You don't need to remember verbatim. A humble person is a person who can't use what they have to get what they want. You know what else a humble person is? A person who receives God's grace. God gives grace to the humble. Do you know why God leads you into the wilderness? To teach you that you're not going to be able to use what you have to get what you want. And when you finally stop stamping your foot, and as we move a little bit out of settler, it doesn't happen at once, settlement to sojourn, we end up becoming weary. And we look up at that point and say, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't press down the feelings that I feel. And we don't gaze at them, and then we find something. It's a lesson that takes time. I can tolerate not having what I want when I'm welcoming, admitting, and longing. It really works, folks. It's not easy. You're holding frustrated desires. Don't pretend that they don't exist. That only causes them to come out sideways. Hold them. You don't have what you want. Hold it. You can grab that. God's not offended. If you say, I don't like that's fine. Of course you don't like all your life. That's not His goal. You can hold it. And hold His hand at the same time. And you know what you can do? You can make it through today like this and not bite people's heads off or not bite your own head off. And you know what's going to happen tomorrow? You have to do it again. You know what's going to happen the next day? Welcome, admit, and long. Because He brings you to a place where there's hardship. He leads people there. See, the frustrating thing is that, I don't know, we come from places where people who claim to speak for God indicate that if you're doing it right, you get what you want. Where does that come from? I don't get that. Well, yeah, I do. It comes from the Old Testament. We live it. Okay, you heard me say this before. Is God going to bless you if you do everything right? Curse you if you do everything wrong? What's the answer? Off by a covenant. Off by a covenant. Leads to holiness. In order to cultivate humility and holiness, sometimes you walk through stuff and it just feels so true. This is one of those things. God will not allow us to become settled. He will cause us via hardship to become unsettled. How can we manage the feelings that overwhelm us, the protest, despair, and detachment that drag us away into all kinds of addiction, all kinds of stuff? Welcome, admit, and long is a place to begin. It's a sojourner's mindset. Is this really necessary? Really? Can't I be nice and moral without all this? Can I vote Republican or Democrat, whichever you feel is more righteous? Without all this stuff? You know what holiness is? That's holiness. Holiness is not shiny, smiley, I am really moral and I'm really godly and I'm really selfish and I'm really self-centered and I want my life. And I'll demand that I get it. That's not holiness. Holiness is when you know that you're going to get it someday because you're welcomed, admitted, and longing. You think like a sojourner, not a settler. And because you know you're going to get it, you pour your life out. You don't spend your life making boundaries. Keep out. I don't want this. Get out. I don't want that. You have to tell, you got to tell people. You can't demand it because It's not home. That's holiness. That's holiness. Holiness is not being moral. It leads to that. Holiness leads to loving people. Holiness leads to being like Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Did he want to? No. But he knew what was going to happen in 100 years. You know what's going to happen in 100 years? All of us. Faith in Christ, you're going to be home. You're not going to have to welcome Edmonton long anymore. You'll be there. Now's the time you welcome Edmonton long. God's committed to you. Part of that is admitting that you're an alien and a stranger on this earth. And it's okay that you don't feel like you fit in, because at one level you don't. You long for a better country. You grab your frustration and you grab his hand as he leads you to places where he'll teach you to be humble. Frustrating places where you won't be able to use what you have to get what you want, but it will develop through hardship and humility and an understanding that I can't do it all, so I might as well help other people who can't do it all either. And that's holiness. Holiness doesn't always look shiny. Holiness looks messy. If you become stubbornly and angrily demanding, you're acting like a settler, not a sojourner. We're confused by sacred settlers. Secular settlers, actually. We get confused by secular settlers who lead us to believe that this world can be paradise if we affiliate with the right political party. Not true. Not true. Doesn't mean don't join up with a political party. I don't care who's in control, Republicans or Democrats. This is not paradise. And having one or the other in control is not going to make this paradise. It's not going to happen. It can't. Because God won't allow it to happen. Worse than that, we could confused by sacred settlers, lead us to believe that we can have our best life now. Both will encourage us to use what we have to get what we want. You know what the problem with boundaries is? They can be used to justify a selfish, self-centered life. That's the problem with them. Boundaries can be a justification for a selfish, self-centered life. We find ourselves railing at others or at God, and the problem with boundaries is that God will not allow us to wall out hardship. Worship team, come on up. Can I put my finger on something in you? Can I define a word that describes what you're dealing with? You're homesick. You're homesick. That's what you are. And in terms of dealing with, welcome it, but breathe spiritually. That's another way you can endure. You breathe spiritually not so that God will make this the Garden of Eden, because it isn't. You breathe spiritually so you can hang on. Be still. I don't have. Be quiet. Be still. Speak freely. Let him know. Exhale your concerns. Hold them. Inhale his commitments. Hold them. And what you'll find, that as you welcome Edmonton long, he'll lead you to places where there will be humility and hardship, but there'll be holiness, the ability to help. If you be still and speak freely, it'll help you go day at a time, just like Jesus went. And then 100 years from now, you won't have to breathe spiritually anymore, but because it will have whatever, it'll be there forever. This is for the nows, in order that we can be holy. Father, I guess I pray a couple things. Help us to deal with our own stuff, to find a place of security in our own wilderness. If we're not there, we will be. All your children, you lead to that place. And we think about boundaries. Help us with others who might be in their own wilderness, and all of us, when we're there, we want somebody to turn it into something other than that. And so that takes wisdom to try to figure out how do we help people without trying to transform something difficult into something pleasurable when it's not supposed to be. I guess we have to learn our lessons, but that takes some wisdom, Jesus. And you were really good at it. You were good at entering and knowing when to distance. And I pray that you would help us to learn that skill as well. I guess it does begin with us, though, to be able to be okay in our own wilderness. We can't let anybody else be okay in theirs if we're not okay in ours. So I guess what I ask then, as we focus, help us to welcome Him at long, and help us to understand that you do cause hardship, and you teach humility because you give grace to the humble, and that allows us to be holy in Jesus' name. Amen. GHC Chambers next week, we'll talk about developing boundaries. Hope you're able to come back.